This is Lecture 7, Institutional Responses to Chicana Artists and Art. Lecture 7 closes the course on Chicana art and artists, and does so with institutional responses. What do we mean by institutional responses? Let's start with institutions. Institutions would be schools, publishing houses, those that produce scholarship, including academic publishing, and archive visibility in the media, and of course, exhibitions at museums and galleries. Inclusion is very important, meaning that Chicana art is exhibited at museums and galleries, and that the work is covered in the media, that archives are kept, and academics publish discussions of Chicana art. Fortunately, exhibitions featuring Chicanx art has attained greater visibility since the 1960s. For example, in the 1990s, we have UCLA's influential Chicano Art, Resistance and Affirmation, or CARA exhibition, and this has only increased in the 21st century, including the Phantom Sightings by LACMA in 2008, and the Getty Foundation's Pacific Standard Time exhibitions, which in 2011 featured 60 exhibitions. 6 were devoted to Chicanx art. And in 2017 and 2018, the Pacific Standard Time exhibitions helped us to focus not just on matters of inclusion, but also the many ways in which Chicanx art expands our understanding of what constitutes American art. And so the question of inclusivity is not necessarily, is Chicanx art showcased at exhibitions, at major exhibitions, but to some extent, how American is Chicanx art. I will make the case inclusion at museums, newspapers, and publishing houses is essential. But I will also try to make the case that in order to understand the complex style, aesthetic, and formal quality that we see in their art requires that we expand institutional frameworks so that we develop new paradigms that take into consideration the contributions of Chicanas to art in general, to the canon of American art specifically. And I'll also make the case that in order to understand some complex reference, that many of them iconographic, we must introduce Chicanx and Latinx art and history in the curriculum early on, starting in nursery school and continuing into higher education. Take a look at this artwork by Yolanda Lopez, titled Portrait of the Artist as the Virgen de Guadalupe from 1978. It's oil pastel on paper. How would a major reporter for, say, the Los Angeles Times critique an artwork like this? What can we say about her confidence, vitality, and strength and joy? What does her cape, the snake, and this aura signify? What is this little angel with red, white, and blue on its wings? To illustrate the difficulties that journalists writing for mainstream media expressed when confronted with Chicanx art, let's consider what Ondine Chavoya explains about William Wilson's 1970 review of the exhibition Arte de los Barrios. Let's read. Some of the earliest exhibition reviews published in newspaper and art magazines framed the critical encounter with Chicano art as an ethnographic expose. Paradigmatic of this style and method is William Wilson's 1970 review of the early group exhibition Arte de los Barrios. As one of the first stories on Chicano art to appear in the Los Angeles Times, Wilson's review is also one of the earliest examples of mainstream journalism's engagement with Chicano art more broadly. Written in the style of a personal chronicle, the review opens with a peculiar admission of disorientation. What's in Harlem? I know how to get there. But Federally Street in East LA, I had to find it on the map. As he travels to the exhibition, the art critic is confronted with his past and personal associations with Chicano art and culture, including growing up on the East LA border in terrified admiration of the Mexican kids who were his schoolmates. After surveying the multimedia exhibition, Wilson asks, sure, this art is about Chicanos, but is it Chicano art? The very heterogeneity of the work on display, presumably formal, aesthetic, and material, confuses the art critic. The critic is frustrated because he did not encounter a more unified or formalized aesthetic, and believes that if a group of people have a homogeneous identity, It has a distinctive artistic language as style. And, as he stridently stipulates, there is nothing homogeneous about the look of Arte de los Barrios. As a result, Wilson reads the exhibition in all of this diversity of form, technique, and imaginary in terms of aesthetic failure and cultural irrelevance. Yet, this evaluated paradigm assumes that Chicanos are always already a homogeneous group, culturally and socially, and that Chicano art is a fixed, well-established, and well-known aesthetic tradition. Some of the themes that are very prevalent in discussions of institutional responses to Chicana art or Chicanx art, or even Latinx art in general, revolve around issues of inclusivity and authenticity. Let's analyze this artwork. Its title is The House That Tequila Built by the Chicana artist Viviana Paredes. It's from 2014. It's made of recycled glass tequila bottles and steel. So to analyze an artwork like this, a very large sculpture, we look to its title for clues. The house. Whose house is it? It could be an abode, and it even affords some sort of privacy inside, as you can see. To what extent should we start thinking also that tequila actually built this house? I found this interview of Viviana Paredes by Yolanda Lopez, a curator, in 2018. And this is what Viviana Paredes said. The house that tequila built is a sculpture that is layered with underlying meanings, meant to intrigue the viewer both visually and intellectually. It became trendy in the United States to drink tequila and now mezcal in the last several years. The one thing that most people know about the maguey plant is that it is a substrate for making tequila. I found it ironic that an American-owned company, which is called Patron, meaning boss in Spanish, produces the national drink of Mexico. I decided that mimicking a maguey shelter out of deconstructed recycled tequila bottles would offer a unique opportunity for viewers to engage in conversations about this sacred plant. I'm interested in the intersections of cultural and environmental issues and how they affect indigenous cultures throughout the world. The maguey is an iconic plant with many medicinal and utilitarian uses. I am intrigued by how the maguey has been used not just in historical art, but also in contemporary Chicano art. I began my own research on the maguey and its many utilitarian and medicinal uses. After learning how every part of the plant has a purpose, I began to see possibilities on how I could use its materials to tell stories. So I found her work extremely interesting because it's multidisciplinary and her focus is on sculpture and glasswork as this one. But also she's an artist who's very deeply involved with plants, which is my area of expertise. My own research is about plants. So I found her very compelling. I respond very well to Viviana Paredes' artworks. And so I highlighted this one. I made this bold, the maguey plant. And I picked this artwork because it will help me to explain the frameworks surrounding institutional responses to Chicano art. So she says that she wants the viewer to be engaged visually, but also intellectually. And she also finds it ironic that US companies, particularly this one called Patron, so who's the boss when you go to Mexico to make tequila to sell in international markets? So maguey is a very sacred plant in Mesoamerica. Here we have Mayahuel, the Aztec goddess of this plant. Maguey or agave plant depicted in the Codex Vaticanus A and early colonial Aztec manuscripts. Here she is depicted on top of a maguey plant. These are the roots and these are the leaves, the pencas. And she's the flower over here. And here are some blooms. We have here the ubiquitous corn as well. This is the ear. These are the maize silks. And here's the goddess sitting on the agave or maguey plant. I'll show you in a second. In Nahuatl is metal, M-E-T-L. Aztec gods and goddesses, Aztec divinity, was often related to nature, including the elements such as wind, water, rain, sun, earth, everything that brings life, animals, including birds, dogs, deer, snakes, or turkey, for example, plants, especially maize and the maguey, but many others as well, leaders or heroes, often ancestors. For example, Quetzalcoatl and Huitzilopochtli. Quetzalcoatl, he was also a creator god in command of wind. So let's see what Paredes knows, what Paredes refers in her sculpture. Ancient Mesoamericans, including the Aztecs, used this plant to make numerous products, including rope, sacks, and also, of course, the alcoholic beverage called pulque, or octli in Nahuatl, and pulque is Spanish. When the plant is ready, 7 to 10 years after planting, is mature enough to produce aguamiel, literally sweet water. When you take out these leaves and at the center of the plant, it's a little bit of a well that produces sweet or honeyed water. And that water, you ferment it for up to 20 days, and it gives it alcoholic beverage. It's very viscous, a little bit thick, and here's a picture of a bottle with it. It's highly nutritious as well, a little bit lower in alcoholic content. So it's a little bit harder to get drunk, for example, on this particular drink. And in Aztec society, the elder and nobility could drink this without restrictions. But there were many restrictions on the rest of the population on when or how to drink it or how much. This is the plant that later in the colonial period, and when Mexico became an independent nation, independent from Spain and became its own country, they began making other alcoholic beverages that were distilled. For example, tequila, a type of mezcal, and it's made in the same way, except I'll show you the process in a second, but it's made from the fermented sap of the maguey plant. And this plant, once it's open, can produce up to 1,000 liters of aguamiel. It can stay productive for up to about 6 months. If you know what you're doing, I put in here the terminology so that you don't get confused. So the plant in Nahuatl is called metal. In Spanish is maguey. In English, agave. And then the beverage is the octli or metoctli or pulque in Spanish. And a lot of times these Spanish words are not derivative from Spanish, but it's corrupted now, classical Nahuatl, by the way. So this is the pre-contact drink, but then you also make mezcal, including tequila. Here's the plant. Look how huge it is, because here's a man, the people skilled in doing this, they're called tlachiquero. Here he is in a black and white photograph from the 1900s, and he's holding an acocote to get the aguamiel, which is right here. So the metal or the maguey or agave plant, after 7 to 10 years from planting, is mature and productive. And there's various signs, including that some of the leaves have lost their sharp edges. Some of them have a very dark tip. The tlachiquero begins discarding some of the leaves to get to the center of the plant right here. And this is the aguamiel, or the sweet or honeyed water that would be fermented. And look over here, I think these are tourists who are very curious about, they're looking at this. And this is a little bit like a straw in some ways, but you suckle here, and then the water gets placed in here, and they put it in containers to ferment it. And here's this photograph from the late 1800s titled Pulquería La Flor Pura en Tacubaya. And pulquería would be the place that you go and buy pulque. And just very quickly, the difference between mezcal and tequila. Tequila basically is a type of mezcal. And so mezcal and tequila are agave-based liquors or spirits. But tequila can only be made from the blue agave. Other types of mezcal can be made from more than 30 varieties. And by the way, Mexico and what was former Mesoamerica, which includes Mexico and parts of Central America, it's a botanical paradise. There's so many varieties of plants. It's exquisite. It's unbelievable. And most of the tequila is produced in Tequila, Jalisco, which was in 2004 or 2006 became a UNESCO site. But it's also producing the states of Guanajuato, Nayarit, Michoacán, and Tamaulipas. Whereas mezcal is produced in other places, including Durango, Guanajuato, Guerrero, Michoacán, Puebla, Oaxaca, San Luis Potosí, Tamaulipas, and Zacatecas. So consequently, not all mezcal are tequila, or all tequilas are mezcal. So all mezcal are made from the agave's core or the piña. I'll show you a picture in a second. Both processes for mezcal and this type of mezcal tequila, they're cooked in earthen pits or steamed in ovens. And this particular one, the more traditional method is to use volcanic rock, charcoal, and wood. And then you distill in clay pots. And these materials cause the smoky flavor. This one is similar, but it's actually distilled once or twice in copper pots, not clay. This is where you cook the piñas, which is the center of the plant, and this is where the leaves would have been. And piñas is the Spanish word for pineapple, which is what you take from the plant to get to the aguamiel. And these are the oak barrels where the mezcal would age. So just very quickly, after the distillation process, which only occurs after the conquest, pre-contact peoples did not do this process to octli or pulque. So as I said, they're made from the sap and from those pineapples I showed you. They're cooked and then aged inside the oak barrels I showed you to produce joven or blanco, silver or white, which is aged up to 2 months. And then reposado or rested is the aging time, 2 months to a year. And then añejo, which means aged at least 1 year for mezcal, and for tequila is from 1 to 2 years. Here are some black and white photographs from 1950 by John Gutman showing the various uses that in the modern period, the descendants of the ancient people of Mesoamerica had for this plant alone. Over here, we see women spinning maguey fiber to make materials for these sacks or rope. And here's a man crushing the leaf of the maguey, as you can see here, to extract the pulp of the maguey for making products. So every part of the plant was used. And this is cactus, is another plant, by the way. People get them confused. And look at the child looking on. And this is how they trained. It's a profession that is dying out, in part due to that maguey slowly becoming extinct, which I think has a lot to do with, obviously, environmental degradation worldwide, but also with the fact that indigenous peoples have lost a lot of their land, and corporations and business interests own this land and use it differently than indigenous peoples do. And here we see a man working out the pulp to free the fiber from the maguey. And here's another person weaving already products. And you can see here is a mat, petates. Again, every piece of the plant was used. Hats can also be made from this fiber. And here's a tlachiquero trying to figure out which plant is ready. As I said, from year 10 to 12, about, develops a spike here, a flower. Once that flower dies out, that's the end of the plant itself, and it dries out to die. But then it leaves pups or little plants that will grow. It's a really amazing plant because so much that it gives indigenous people, and everybody in Mexico actually, because it makes products from every part of the leaf. But also the aguamiel is extremely nutritious and given to children early on. And once it's fermented, it's also very high in nutrients. And the aguamiel, by the way, is only used for octli or pulque, not for the mezcales, including tequila. Those are made from the piñas, the sap, not the aguamiel. And as you can see, it's actually a very ancient plant that was used in ancient times as this ceramic vessel with cut maguey leaves here shows. It's from the 2nd century before the Common Era, or perhaps the 3rd century before the Common Era. Actually, I made a mistake here. And it's from the Colima civilization. This profession of the tlachiquero requires a lot of training and a lot of botanical understanding about this plant and how to handle all of these materials. The plant itself can be very dangerous. It has a lot of thorns and spikes here. Somebody who doesn't know what they're doing can be seriously hurt. But also you have to understand the chemical properties of these materials, because otherwise all that work that goes into making these beverages that are so nutritious will be lost, because instead of processing correctly, you will have putrefaction or spoiling. So going back to the artwork, Viviana Paredes says, I think that I am who I am because of my exposure to the rich history of the Bay Area with its long history of political activism. I believe that it is both an opportunity and a personal commitment to use my place as an artist to make art that is both visually pleasing while telling important stories about my cultural experience as a Chicana, as an environmental feminist, and as a member of the human race. My existence is my resistance. Making art is how I cope with our current political climate and the devastating global environmental crisis we are facing. So that's giving us a little bit more context because she's telling us she's an environmental feminist. She's repurposing these bottles, but the Patron company discards. And she's also telling us that the political activism of the Bay Area, but also her cultural experience as a Chicana, which by definition has to do with these ties to Mexico and a pre-contact past, can help us to analyze a sculpture like this. So Viviana Paredes has taken discarded glass from US companies that make this drink to sell internationally and makes a house, a shelter. And the title is also very provocative because it's implying that the tequila built the house. It's a little bit of a play on words that this sacred plant of the agave has made this possible. And so you can see the confluence of ideas here regarding home and regarding a change, right, between the maguey and pulque or Oakley to the varieties of tequila that are distilled after the conquest. And remember what she said about US corporations going to Mexico for these very lucrative ventures in making these alcoholic beverages. So in part, you have to have some context to analyze a sculpture like this one, because it is very engaging visually and of course intellectually too. And it requires that we do some deeper analysis than just a cursory review. It also requires some knowledge of history from contact until the present. And it includes both ancient Mesoamerica and the United States currently. And look at this painting from the Academy by the renowned Mexican artist, Jose Maria Obregon. Oh, I forgot the accent here. From 1869, its title is El Descubrimiento del Pulque, The Discovery of Pulque, or Oakley. It's an oil on canvas, and what we're seeing here is an idealized version of the discovery of Pulque. It depicts an event supposedly from 900 of the Common Era at Tula, the capital city of the Toltec Empire. And here we see the Tlatoani, or the ruler, Tecpancaltzin, and in front of him are the parents of this young woman named Xochitl. And that word means flower. And over here you see them, they have discovered pulque, and they want to tell the king about this drink. This painting, like I said, is an idealized version, starting with a very European-looking bodies. It attempts some pre-contact conventions, but this is more reminiscent of European art. Moreover, the theme that it represents is also idealized because this event, supposedly from 900 Common Era, the Tlatoani was taken by the maiden, married this young woman because he was overtaken by her beauty. So it's like a really idealized and romantic love, when in reality, Mesoamericans figured out how to make pulque thousands of years before this. Indigenous peoples here are depicted as though they were characters in classical Greece or Rome. This can be very dangerous because it separates the descendants of these indigenous peoples. It tends to create a chasm between modern day indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, because the myth that they all disappeared when Europeans arrived is just that, a myth. And they continue to live throughout the continent. And in Mesoamerica, modern day Mexico and Central America, the descendants of these indigenous peoples therefore are still there and continue these ancient traditions. The painting is reminiscent of this painting, Christopher Columbus at the Court of the Catholic Monarchs, by Juan Cordero, another celebrated Mexican artist of the 19th century. And this oil on canvas is of the genre history painting, here featuring Christopher Columbus arriving in Spain at the court of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. Columbus brings with him a delegation of indigenous peoples, here shown in the lower left corner, shown in darkness. And the male has arrows or weapons in his back, but instead of shown standing up, he's submissive. And Europeans here are shown illuminated. So as you can see, Chicana art can express multiple references, that is multilingual and multi-visual and multimedia, complex iconography that often includes Mesoamerican and indigenous themes, as well as Catholic and Western, meaning Europe and the United States. It offers counter discourses on ethnicity, class, and gender, and often expresses political messages related to resistance because the establishment, society or government, and its many institutions sustaining that society tend to oppress rather than liberate Chicanas in their experience. And in the case of Paredes, the political message also pertains to environmental degradation, perhaps also corporate greed, including the fact that the Mexican government allows, and the US government allows, for US corporations to go into Mexico and develop very lucrative deals. It's not always easy to analyze or interpret Chicana artwork. One last thing about Paredes' work. This artwork and what Paredes said about it, the origin of tequila. Where does it come from? How is it made? And what are the costs? Meaning, if you consider that these agave are ancient and they are part of indigenous people's very livelihood because of its nutritional content, and also the fact that they use absolutely every piece of the plant to make various objects. And I didn't show you a photograph. They even use it to make roofing for houses. All of that is the intellectual engagement that Paredes was talking about, what she wishes to evoke in people. And so all of that led me to the issue of monoculture and the problem that brings to indigenous peoples, our environment, and the disconnect between modernity, shown over here, and nature. And we have to ask ourselves, is maguey becoming a monoculture? And why would that be significant? Are corporations' demands for this plant affecting production of the nutritious aguamiel and pulque? And what about the people engaged in the production of tequila? We know that indigenous communities throughout the Americas have planted for subsistence for millennia, including today. But modernity has forced them to, instead of growing a variety of plants for their own consumption and selling the surplus to others, to what extent is the land and labor of traditional communities, including the indigenous ones, engaging in monoculture? This is very significant. Listen to what Vandana Shiva, an environmental advocate, says about the dangers of monoculture. Listen.
Monocultures are nutritionally impoverished. The same acre of land, using biodiversity, using organic and ecological methods, could produce 5 to 10 times more nutrition than a monoculture can. So maximizing the production of commodities for international trade is directly proportionate to the decrease in nutrition availability to local communities, which is why hunger grows. If the world has to be fed, it has to be fed by growing food locally, to be used locally as the biggest proportion of the food basket. Some elements will be traded internationally, but what is traded internationally should not be staple foods. What is traded internationally should be that extra flavor of spices from India and coffee from Guatemala. That's all right. But to turn the world into a dependency on staples has nothing to do with feeding the world. It has a lot to do with controlling the food supply. The United States evolved a phrase during the Vietnam War, and the phrase was food as a weapon. The use of food as the ultimate weapon of control. And the tragedy is the growth of agribusiness in the US has gone hand in hand with the US foreign policy to deliberately create hunger locally in order to make the world dependent on food supplies through which you can then control countries and their decision-making ability. Food production must once again be an issue of sustainability. Taking care of the earth and the human right to food must be an inalienable right. These rights cannot be ensured through a marketplace where food has become a commodity and a subject of speculation. We saw what speculation did in 2008. Food prices doubled, and the companies that control the food system doubled their profits, while riots took place in 40 countries.
Now let's analyze this artwork. It's by ASCO, an artist collective formed by Chicana youth in East Los Angeles, active from 1972 to 1987. Members were Harry Gamboa Jr., Gronk, Willie Herron, and Patsy Valdez. The title of the work is Spray Paint LACMA, 1972. It's a photograph depicting Patsy Valdez posing in an outdoor area of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And the artists signed their names here. They tagged their names. This artwork encapsulates so much information. Whereas for the curators at LACMA, they didn't see her, Patsy Valdez. They only saw the signatures of the artists and immediately whitewashed it. I think the same day or the next day. They painted over it. But these artists, what they were trying to do was gain access into LACMA because they had gone to the museum. They were not seeing in the collections any Chicano artwork exhibited at these institutions of art. And another thing that this helps us to understand is that the artists from Moscow and many others, and there were many others, by the way, who were associated not only with ASCO, but also with other artist collectives that formed around this time period as well. And as I explained in the lecture on public art, Chicano youth was accused of not wanting to serve in the armed forces, which was untrue. And look what Gronk says. A lot of our friends were coming back in body bags and were dying. And we were seeing a whole generation come back that weren't alive anymore. And in a sense, that gave us nausea. That is ASCO in a way. And look at the way he says it. They were not alive anymore. On the one hand, you have people who actually died. And I think that he's saying here that other ones died inside. And this was echoed by all of them. Patsy Valdez, she also expressed this sentiment. Here's a video in which the artists of ASCO explain how they began, their work, and inspiration. Watch.
Los Angeles was a place of tumultuous change in the early 1970s. The Chicano rights movement helped bring about a greater sense of empowerment and self-identity. Mainstream America was finally taking notice of Chicanos, and the arts were in the forefront of that attention. In East Los Angeles, 4 friends were pushing the limits of artistic expression in their community. Their non-conforming attitude reflected the spirit of the times, and the art they produced became an inspiration to a generation of younger artists. This talented group of 4 came to be known as ASCO.
Hello. So you probably want to know about ASCO. I guess that's why you're here.
The name ASCO, which is Spanish for nausea, came from people's reactions to us personally, to the quality of the work, which dealt with violence and themes of depression.
ASCO.
And then we had an exhibit, and I remember looking around the room, and we were saying, oh my God, this work gives us ASCO.
It was my idea to call the exhibition ASCO and for the exhibition to be an exhibition of our worst work.
Everyone thought it was the name of the group, and we decided to adopt it, and we therefore, empowered ourselves by using a negative term and creating a positive out of it.
Regarding the obstacles artists and all Chicano youth faced in the 60s and 70s, and even in the 80s, 90s, and today, in the 21st century, all report the abusive conditions they faced at schools. They also report ample police brutality, which was absolutely widespread among Chicanas and Chicanos. There was a lot of racial profiling, and police officers would stop Mexican youth from their cars and tell them to get out, that they had to search the car. They explained the situation that they faced at the schools, in which she remembers being in a classroom in which they were told that in home economics that they must pay attention because soon enough they would be cleaning and helping people around their house. And her reaction was, what are you talking about? I'm going to become a great artist. And she did. And the males were expected to go to war and serve in the Vietnam War. And in 2016, I had the privilege of welcoming Gorank to one of my classes. And here he is still addressing the students. The whole hour, he was speaking to the students. And I was so starstruck, I asked for a photograph. And there I am smiling with my dopey smile. And he actually struck a pose. So dope. In this lecture, it became so clear how intellectually engaged these Chicano artists are, and all of that is reflected in their work. At this time, my students got a rare opportunity to hear from artists. So I'm going to show you some video also. When artists from ASCO explain how Chicanas and Chicanos were perceived by those in mainstream media and other institutions, including schools, pay attention to how teachers and the media portray.
ASCO was actually a surrogate family for me at one point. It was also an alternative to a gang. It was also an alternative to other things that were negative in the community.
We lived within a 10-mile radius from each other, so it was easy for us to stay in contact with each other, and we related to a lot of the same things.
We were all having dialogues about different things that bothered us. The school that we went to was horrible. Teachers didn't teach. You would look at television, you'd never see yourself there, and if you did, you were a cholo or chola. And you were like, where am I in this picture? I don't exist anywhere.
In 1970, 71, 72, everyone was penniless. So we had no space, artist space. Willie had a small garage behind his mother's house, which when it wasn't occupied by gang members, we would take it over.
In 1970, Harry Gamboa became the editor of Regeneración, a Chicano publication made up of articles, essays, and poetry that related to the Chicano community.
We started meeting on a regular basis and brainstorming for images for this magazine. So we started hanging out like for hours on end and drawing together.
Our work evolved around each other, being around each other.
So all of us worked together on this publication called Regeneración, and we would drink coffee and talk about the world, and that's how we started to collaborate with one another.
I didn't have anyone I could talk to about what it was to be an artist or the issues I had in my mind, in my head. And I remember meeting up with Gronk at East LA College and sort of talking to him about different questions I had about art making. He sort of became one of my mentors.
With Patsy, we collaborated on a lot of photo type images. She utilized makeup, she utilized costuming to create images and portray hundreds of characters. So I think like a lot of different images that she created was breaking a lot of stereotypes, I believe, at that time. And with Harry, it was like inverting words and playing with language. It was challenging and exciting because I think Harry was trying to destroy the English language as we know it. And I believe he said that he was going to replace it with charred pieces of metal. Those kinds of ideas to me were exciting to work with a team of people that were challenging all kinds of different notions on the way we hear and see things.
I was probably known more for my murals in the 70s than probably any of the other members of ASCO. And most of the time I would receive the commissions or the projects. I had Gronk assist me in quite a few mural projects.
The exciting thing I think for me was that Willie would start on one end, I would start on the other end, and all of a sudden the piece would merge right in the middle.
The end result was truly a collaboration rather than it's my job and he assisted me to execute my idea. We
sort of started our relationship with an element of trust, I believe, and we just allowed each other to work together and play music, but instead we used the brush to do that and canvas or a wall.
The group's first documented performance was presented in 1971.
we decided to create an anti-war statement, anti-Vietnam War statement, by essentially recreating the Stations of the Cross.
And I played Jesus Christ carrying the cross. Grunk was Pontius Pilate.
I decided to dress up as sort of a zombie-like altar boy, wearing an actual animal skull on top of my head.
We basically paraded down Whittier Boulevard to the recruiting station and sort of collected people as we walked. People just started to follow us.
Before you knew it, we were all heading towards the Marine recruiting station, where we leaned up the cross, dumped all of our costumes and the popcorn, and we left it there, so it essentially blockaded the recruitment center. So for that particular day, there would be no more Chicanos joining the Marines and going off to Vietnam.
We used to have a Christmas parade in East LA on Whittier Boulevard. And due to the riots, the parade was taken away. There was no more Christmas parade. And so we, as a group, decided that we were going to bring back the parade. And we decided that we would become the float. We would dress up, and we were going to walk through Whittier Boulevard during Christmas time. All of a sudden, my mom goes, "Grunk's here," and you look out, and there's Grunk walking up to my front door, dressed in like layers of green chiffon.
Picture this.
He was a Christmas tree with all these Christmas bulbs hanging on him.
My face was a star, so this was this Christmas tree walking down the city street.
I was the Virgen of Guadalupe, but I recreated her. I wore like a black glittered outfit and these platform shoes.
Muralism was being approached in a very traditional way. We thought we would take it a step further, and with that idea, I decided to just sort of have myself wear the mural and walk with it down the street so it could be a sort of a moving work of art.
And we did shock people. The policemen followed us. We had to have bodyguards. But it was, I think it was a great success.
We took the same procession across the same path that we did the year before with the Stations of the Cross. My involvement with it this time was that I was interested in documenting it and presenting it elsewhere so that we could reach a broader audience. A similar situation occurred as with the Station of the Cross. We started picking up recruits, people who became interested in participating in this thing, and as opposed to being religious converts, this time the people were essentially art converts.
In the years that followed, Oscar went on to produce a variety of street performances, including the first supper after a riot, which took place on a traffic island. Gronk, ever fascinated by the concept of producing temporal art, created the instant mural. A work of art was conceived on the spot by taping a person to a wall.
Well, in 1972, of course, I was much younger and much more naive, and I decided that I'd taken a stroll through the LA County Museum and realized that there was not a single Chicano exhibited in the museum. And so I decided just to pound on the door and to the curator, and I had a brief discussion with him in which I asked him, "Why don't you exhibit Chicano artists?" And he said, "Oh, Chicanos, they don't do art, they're in gangs."
That night, Oscar returned and in gang fashion signed their names on the museum walls. They could now claim the LA County Museum as their own art piece.
We would create these images that implied a preceding and succeeding image, even though there wasn't any. And therefore the name No Movie came to represent those kind of images in which it implied that it was a scene out of a movie.
Coming out of a sense of poverty, you used whatever was available. Physically, we used ourselves to transform and become many different characters because, again, we were not in movies. We created our own. We called them no movies, making movies without the use of celluloid.
Into the 80s, under the direction of Gronk and Gamboa, Osco evolved into an artists' collective that came to include a dozen or so participants. Each of the original ASCO members have pursued productive careers in the arts. They are well regarded by arts establishments and by their peers. Their work has been staged, published, and exhibited nationally and internationally. Each have gained a certain degree of success in their fields, and their work continues to challenge and inspire other artists.
No gallery was going to call us up and say, we're going to give you a show, and we didn't wait around for that.
We went out and did things, and we used hit-and-run tactics. We didn't ask for permission to do any of our projects.
We didn't just sit around like complaining. We took action. We made it happen.
We were people of color who were out there doing things on the streets.
We were going to make art about what we were living at the time, about our dreams, and about anything we chose. We were not going to stay in a little box.
In 1968, Garfield High in East Los Angeles had the highest dropout rate in the nation. The educational system seemed to be more of an obstacle than a help to Chicano youth.
I first started out at elementary school as a monolingual Spanish-speaking child. My first day of school, I was instructed on how to make a dunce cap, which was immediately put on my head. I couldn't read the word that was spelled onto it, but the word was spelled Spanish. And they told me I could take that off when I learned to speak English. But I decided to learn English basically as a form of defense, which I could then later refine into a weapon of offense.
I had this homemaking class, and the teacher used to make the most ridiculous statements in class. She would say, well, all you little Mexicans better do well in this class, because someday you're all going to be cooking and cleaning for other people. And I used to think about it and go, what? This lady's nuts. I ain't going to cook for anybody.
And going back to the issue of why the artworks of Chicanas might seem unreadable to people outside the community has historic roots. Chicanas and Chicanos have been systematically denied access to mainstream society in the United States. But one of the problems begins early on. In spite of the fact that, as we said in lecture 1, Mexican Americans have always been in the United States because half of the country was, in 1846, Mexico. And the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo stipulated that everyone who remained would automatically become a U.S. citizen 2 years from the signing of the treaty. By definition, most people were going to stay, except for those who were coerced to abandon their land, because who would want to lose their real estate and everything that they own and they worked for. And of course, Mexican Americans have been deeply engaged in the forming of this country in various forms, including with legislation. I'll just remind you what we said in lecture 1 about the Mendez versus Westminster case in 1947, which led the way to the landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education. And just as a reminder, the Mendez versus Westminster was financed and filed by Mexican American families. And I cannot overemphasize the importance of this landmark case. In fact, one of the leading lawyers in Brown versus Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall, he's the first African American appointed to be a justice in the Supreme Court. And he, of course, was hoping, though not entirely sure, that in 1947, Mendez et al. Would actually win this case. But of course, he lent as much support as he could. And once everybody saw that this case was won, they filed the Brown versus Board of Education. I went over this case in lecture 1, and these cases outlawed segregation in the school system. And one of the things I'd like to highlight is that the parents of Sylvia Mendez, and here she is receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Barack Obama. Her parents said at the school that what the school system wanted was to offer Mexican American and Latino children in general a sub-education. And they sought to make them feel bad and train them for very specific jobs, especially low-paying jobs. And then, very significant, the 1954 Supreme Court case, Hernandez versus Texas, when the Supreme Court declared that the United States is indeed composed by more than black and white people. So they acknowledged the fact that Other groups besides Black persons and white persons are excluded from discourse and from legal protection sometimes. And here's a photograph of Gus Garcia speaking at the Supreme Court. And Hernandez v. Texas also invoked the 14th Amendment, so-called Civil Rights Amendment, because it was passed at the end of the Civil War in the United States. One of the things that the amendment stipulates is that everyone is equal under the law and access to due process, have a fair trial. And that Chicano lawyers representing Mr. Hernandez in the Supreme Court said that Texas does not allow Mexican Americans or Latin American people to be part of juries. And this case highlighted the concerted effort to continue the false narrative that Mexican Americans are either non-existent or immigrants. Other involvement includes blowouts or walkouts from the 1960s, part of the civil rights movement, El Movimiento for Chicanos or Mexican Americans. A brilliant lawyer, a Chicano brilliant lawyer, here he is. His name was Oscar Zeta Acosta. He defended Mexican American youth. And he actually had the audacity to put the judges themselves on trial, demonstrating to them that even though they were not trying to be racist, in effect, they were being racist. He says, I'm not saying that the judges are evil persons by any means whatsoever. And I'm not saying that they are even evil in the sense they don't name nominees of Spanish surname. What is pathetic, tragic, is that none of them know any of them, meaning Mexican Americans. Now, since they are nominating their friends, how in the world are they going to nominate us since they don't know us? We don't exist. And again, this rhetoric of Mexicans not existing, of the United States being made up completely of Black and white persons, is actually not as innocuous as it may seem. Because in the 1960s, this really affected Mexican American families because protesting youth were incarcerated and not given their due process in courts. In fact, many of them were accused of being violent and bloodthirsty because they were descendants of indigenous peoples, including the Maya and the Aztecs. And by the way, the same thing exists for Asian Americans from the Middle East and Asia, obviously, and shockingly, indigenous peoples who have never ceded their lands in the United States. And here's a Oscar Zeta Acosta with Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, author of the famous I Am Joaquin. Look at what Ruben Salazar, an LA Times correspondent, said. Acosta is easily recognized in court by his loud ties and flowered attaché case with a Chicano power sticker. And look at these young boys, Latino boys, protesting. And he says, a shotgun is not a search warrant. And this one, we haven't broken into your homes. Don't break into ours. Gracias, or give us your address. Look what happens in Arizona. In 2010, Governor Brewer signed House Bill 2281, which imposed restrictions on courses featuring race and class. This is House Bill 2281 from Arizona. It prohibits diversified curricula at schools in the district or even charter schools. They're forbidding instruction courses that promote resentment towards a race or class, or discussions of controversial aspects of history, or classes including history of any ethnic group. This is detrimental to real knowledge, isn't it? Because not only does it limit which histories you're going to study, it limits the inevitable social interactions that existed. Consequently, it gives a very narrow view of the world and where we have been historically and where we are going as well. Thanks to the 1960s El Movimiento, or Chicano civil rights movement, when young students and youth in general, but also teachers, including Sal Castro, parents, and other concerned citizens, took to the streets to demand the government to have better schools for Mexican American children and Latino children in general. And also the Cuban Revolution of 1959 really scared the United States because they feared that other countries in Latin America would follow the same history as Cuba. Consequently, many colleges and universities in the United States opened Latin American studies. Many colleges and universities also offer pre-contact or pre-Columbian art. And even though the gains for Chicano studies departments were modest, they were nevertheless very significant. Some of the most prestigious institutions of higher learning, including UCLA, UC Berkeley, and Stanford University, for example, opened Chicano studies departments. UCLA even has Chicano Studies Research Center, which boasts a library, archives, and even a journal, press. And that is very significant because look what Charlene Villaseñor Black said about the journal affiliated with UCLA titled Aztlan, a Journal of Chicano Studies, which began to be published by UCLA students in 1970. She writes, Aztlan has a long history of publishing important research articles in Chicana and Chicano art history, providing a venue for scholars working in this emergent field. This was particularly important since the field of art history has been slow to embrace the study of Chicana and Chicano or Latina and Latino art. The flagship journal of art history, the Art Bulletin, published by the College Art Association, has never published an article on Chicana, Chicano, or Latina, Latino art. CIA also publishes the Art Journal, the purpose of which, according to its website, is to focus on topics related to 20th and 21st century concerns. Nor has it published very much related to Chicana, Chicano, or Latina, Latino art, as revealed by a search of its issues dating back to 1965. This is both revealing and concerning. But again, there have also been some gains. For example, in 1990, the influential exhibition Chicano Art Resistance and Affirmation, CARA, featuring work from 1965 to 1985, brought many Chicana and Chicano artists who had been largely marginalized to the spotlight. And this exhibition traveled to various cities in the United States, including in California, Texas, and in Washington, D.C. It even elicited important academic work, Alicia Gaspar de Alba's book, Chicano Art, Inside Outside the Master's House. Gaspar de Alba addressed the institutional and psychological challenges that this exhibition posed on mainstream discourse in critics and the public at large. It also analyzed the press's polarized responses that went from strong acclaim to some ambivalence. It also encouraged discussions among scholars and critics, and also the general public, about differences in opinion, even defining who is a Chicano or a Chicana, and also issues of geography, generation, political allegiance, and even which historic experiences should be highlighted. The 21st century elicited more exhibitions, catalogs, and academic books on Chicano and Chicana art. This is not an exhaustive list, but highlights the greater visibility that Chicanx art has enjoyed in the 21st century. And this has come after much knocking and arduous work. Some major ones, including The Road to Aztlan, Art from a Mythic Homeland at LACMA, one on posters, Phantom Sightings, also at LACMA, and also a retrospective on the work of the artists working in the ASCO collective. Solo exhibitions such as Our Lady of Controversy, Alma Lopez's Irreverent Apparition, which led to very important dialogues. Let's end the lecture by focusing on this very last point. One of the many themes that Chicana artists depict in their work pertains to immigration. In the 1990s, Latino voters flipped to California, and that was in response to anti-immigrant laws. A leading political scientist, Rafe Sonnenschein, called this a bloodless revolution. Flipping means turning one state that is overwhelmingly from one party to the other. Could be from Republican to Democrat or Democrat to Republican. In this case, it went Republican to Democrat. And more recently, of course, we're very familiar with the tragedies regarding immigration and the policies that certain government leaders institute, including the current ones of separating families who are seeking asylum. And this one in 2018, when Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez was gunned down by immigration services in 2018 at age 20. And she was coming from Guatemala, a place known for terrible persecution especially of indigenous peoples, which the United States supports, often because they signify cheap labor. And this was widely reported in the media. There's even video that a woman took, and she's heard asking the officer, "Why did you kill the girl?" And the officer killed her with one shot to the head. And what Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez was doing was seek asylum in the United States, and she wanted to go to medical school. And now let me show you a short video explaining what happened in the 1990s, because it's still relevant today. Let's watch.
Who many remember from his column, Ask a Mexican, from the Orange County Weekly, now with the Los Angeles Times. He has something in the newspaper today, an essay on what we learned about Prop 187. Thank you for coming.
Gracias for having me.
For people who don't remember this, you don't remember it, I remember it. It was extremely controversial, and there was a tremendous amount of political upheaval. Where were you at that time?
I was a sophomore in high school, 15 years old at Anaheim High School, and I remember the way I found out about 187. I was walking back home, a truck full of white boys start yelling at me, 187, 187. I'm like, oh, okay, whatever.
That's the penal code for murder, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, I didn't even know that, though, then. And then I walk home. I actually watched Channel 4 News. I turned on the TV, and there was a segment about Proposition 187. Then I realized, okay, so they're yelling at me because I'm Mexican, so they want me out of the state. They think I am somehow destroying California, and I just found it very sad.
We should point out, again, it passed with 60% of the vote. It was set aside by a federal bench. But the ramifications of this over the past 25 years have been enormous.
Proposition 187 is as fundamental to changing California as a gold rush and Proposition 13. The whole reason why we have a supermajority of Democrats in Sacramento now, in both sides of the legislature, is because of Proposition 187. It woke up a generation of Latinos who said, I'm not going to be demonized anymore. My parents are not going to be demonized anymore. I'm going to be successful. I'm going to run. At the same time, though, Proposition 187 also uncorked the xenophobic genie that has spread all across the United States and led directly to Trump being in the White House, using the same rhetoric that Pete Wilson was using 25 years ago.
Should point out, besides your essay, there's a podcast that has dropped called California, This is California, from the Los Angeles Times. First several episodes, you were talking about this topic, and then you interviewed, for example, Barbara Kiley, who had a hand in all this.
Yeah, Proposition 187, she was one of the consultants, her and her husband, Barbara and Bob Kiley. And if you remember, the whole initiative was called the Save Our State Initiative. So one of the great anecdotes from that from the podcast, I asked her, who thought of the idea Save Our State? She's like, oh, we thought of it over 4 margaritas at El Torito.
That's great.
Amazing.
Gloria Molina is also, she was a former LA County supervisor. She got into the act because of this.
She got a lot of death threats. She got a lot of hate mail. I was able to go to the Huntington Library in San Marino, read some of those hate letters that she was getting into. But it was a civil war, really, in California over 187. That's what people can't believe anymore, that an anti-illegal immigrant initiative would have passed with 59 to 41%. That would be impossible in the state. No one even dared. The Republican Party doesn't even dare bring it up statewide.
Peter Nunez was one of the architects of 187. What did he tell you?
Peter Nunez was a U.S. attorney on the border. He said that he was there being able to show politicians what's going on with undocumented people coming into the border. So he created it. He had very not nice things to say about Dan Lundgren, that's the former Attorney General of California.
Because?
Because he felt that the reason Lundgren did not want to appeal 187 to the federal courts was because he was looking for his political future, did not want to anger Latino voters.
The essay today, the podcast, what do you want people to get from it?
I want people to learn what happened 25 years ago, explains the America of today, explains the California of today. This is California history. This is not just Mexican-American history. This is history that impacts all of us. And also, this is a way to show folks that the LA Times is doing stories that matter about California. So, yeah, have fun. Download it.
Gustavo Arellano from the Los Angeles Times, a native of Anaheim. Dad was a
truck driver.
Mom was a
tomato canner.
Okay,
Hunts.
there you go. The American dream. Thank you very much for joining us.
Gracias.
In sum, this lecture covered institutional responses to Chicana artists and their artworks, including at schools, publications, museums, and the media. And the conclusion is that we must delve in rich history that includes an indigenous past and present, and a very close and yet extremely complex relationship between Mexico and the United States, also past and present. And I try to highlight some of the debates and the fact that significant progress has been made, something that should be celebrated. But this was after much arduous work within the Chicano community, but with assistance from allies in the African American community, Asian Americans, indigenous peoples, and many Chicanas identify as indigenous, and also many in mainstream society. There's much more still to be done, and I'm going to end by showing you a series of images of artworks so you can begin using the concepts that I used to analyze and use it so that you can have a personal engagement and your own interpretation about the art. The lecture will end with a clip showing Viviana Paredes. Y Reina Cervantes, La Ofrenda from 1989. Judith Baca, The Great Wall of Los Angeles, 1976 to 1983. Alma Lopez's California Fashion Slaves, 1997. Esther Hernandez, Immigrant Woman's Dress, 1997. Delilah Montoya, Humane Borders, Water Station, 2004. Yolanda Lopez, Free, Los Siete, 1969. Yolanda Lopez, Who's the Illegal Alien Pilgrim, 1978. Santa Barraza, Nepantla, 1995. Consuelo Jiménez Underwood, Virgen de los Caminos, 1994. This is a close-up of that work. Celia Álvarez Muñoz, Lana Sube, 1988. Celia Álvarez Muñoz, La Navaja, part of Lana Sube, also from 1988. Esther Hernandez's Son Mad, 1982. Esther Hernandez's Son Raid from 2008. Esther Hernandez, La Virgen de Guadalupe defendiendo los derechos de los Chicanos, The Virgin of Guadalupe defending the rights of the Chicanos. Alma Lopez, Our Lady from 1999. Delilah Montoya, La Guadalupana from 1998. A photograph of the installation of Shizu Saldamando exhibition of selected works at Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art in 2019. Shizu Saldamando's Tiffany and Kathy, 2019. Shizu Saldamando, Irina and Ami o las Tres Adelitas, 2011. Y Reina Cervantes, Big Baby Balam, 1991. Patsy Valdez, No Canary, 1972. Diane Gamboa, Cutting Through, 1995. Patricia Rodriguez, Josefa Juanita, 1977. Laura Aguilar, Three Eagles Flying, 1990. Laura Aguilar, Gilbert's Altar, 2001. Alma Lopez, Lupe and Sirena in Love, 1999. Yolanda Lopez, Portrait of the Artist as the Virgen de Guadalupe, 1978. Yolanda Lopez's Nuestra Madre, 1981 to 1988. Laura Aguilar, In Sandy's Room, 1989. Laura Aguilar, Clothed, Unclothed, 1991. Diane Gamboa, Altered State, 1999. Diane Gamboa from the series Invasion of the Snatch. Amelia Besabaines, An Ofrenda for Dolores del Rio, 1984. Patsy Valdez, Scattered, 1987. Diane Gamboa, Self-Portrait, 1984.